A woman spent 20 years turning herself into a queen, and then somebody gave her 48 hours to pack. King Charles stood inside Clarence House and watched his wife of nearly 20 years leave on a schedule he set himself. The reason has nothing to do with anything most people would guess. There was no public quarrel about affection. There was no sudden revelation of private coldness. What surfaced instead were secret bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands that nobody in that family knew existed until a routine audit tripped straight over them. The speed of what followed is the detail that still refuses to settle. 5 days. 5 days from the moment the king learned the full picture to the moment a woman lost titles she had spent 2 decades earning. Institutions do not move like that. They never have. Something forced the pace. Somebody inside that family stood in a room in the middle of November, looked at a piece of paper, and made a decision that could not be walked back. Had that decision gone the other way, and it very nearly did, none of this would ever have reached the public. I am Harold. I spend my time reading the filings, the official records, and the material that tends to be buried before questions are finished. What follows is the sequence as I have pieced it together. Stay with it to the end, because the last movement of this story rests on someone most observers were not watching. The public first saw the matter at 6:47 on the morning of the 3rd of December. Palace statements do not ordinarily appear at that hour. They arrive later, after language has been walked around the building and softened until its meaning requires a second reading. This one arrived before most of Britain had put the kettle on, and it said precisely what it meant. Buckingham Palace announced that the king had formally requested parliamentary action regarding the titles and status of Camilla Parker Bowles, using her maiden name in the official text. Anyone who follows this family recognized the signal at once. No one inserts a woman's pre-marriage name into a palace document by accident. The choice was deliberate, and the message beneath it was that the institution had already ceased to count her as one of its own. The statement continued that serious financial irregularities and undisclosed accounts had been discovered, and that continuing the title of Queen Consort was no longer appropriate. This was not the language of a private separation. Couples part, and the palace issues 3 careful sentences about mutual respect and the need for privacy. What appeared that morning was a severing, the institution cutting a person out of itself in public at dawn without cushioning of any kind. The timing made clear they wanted the story told by them before anyone else could shape it. Financial scandals inside large institutions normally take months. An irregularity surfaces. Auditors write it up. Lawyers review the write-up. Somewhere in the 4th month, a communications team begins constructing a version the public can receive without the building catching fire. By the time ordinary people hear of it, the edges have been sanded down into something survivable. None of that process occurred here. The king received the full picture on the 28th of November. The statement went out on the 3rd of December. In those 5 days, an emergency session of the Privy Council was convened, legislation was drafted overnight, Parliament was required to act, and the king signed away his own wife's titles. Either the evidence was overwhelming, or personal fury overrode every institutional instinct toward delay. From everything I have examined, both forces were present, and a third element was also at work. That third element is the piece I have held back until its proper place in the sequence. Everything that happens to Camilla in public still rests on a grave. Diana died in 1997, and Britain decided that day who bore responsibility. No amount of subsequent good behavior has fully closed that account. That is the ground on which this scandal landed, and it is the reason 5 days proved possible at all. The country had never entirely released the earlier verdict, and the institution knew it. The sequence began with something so ordinary most people would have scrolled past it. In May of 2025, Parliament passed legislation requiring enhanced financial transparency for senior members of the royal family who receive public funding. No individual was targeted. Nothing was aimed at any particular household. No one in the family objected at the time because on paper the measure looked like housekeeping. It was the sort of modernization governments like to announce when public pressure for accountability has built to the point where something must be released. Independent audits, full disclosure of assets, ordinary governance that most public institutions already practice and that the monarchy had quietly avoided. The audit firm Reynolds Partners began its review in September. They started at the top with the king, then moved to the Queen Consort's office. The Queen Consort's finances were expected to be the straightforward afternoon of the entire exercise. An allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal wealth from an earlier marriage settlement, household expenses filed and unremarkable. No one anticipated difficulty. In October, an auditor named Sarah Mitchell noticed something while working through payment authorizations. Monthly Monthly payments of roughly £5,000 were leaving for what appeared to be a financial management firm in Luxembourg. £5,000 a month is not a sum that announces criminality. That is precisely why it had sat unnoticed. The size was never the issue. The payments had never been properly categorized inside the palace accounting system. Mitchell requested documentation. The replies came back vague. Estate management services, no contract, no named estate. Anyone who has worked near auditing recognizes a vague answer to a precise question as a warning flare. Auditors are not naturally suspicious. They are usually bored. Nothing wakes them faster than unhelpfulness about a modest figure. Mitchell followed protocol and asked to speak directly with the Luxembourg firm. The firm was not managing any estate. It was managing nothing. It was a shell company, an entity that exists only on paper, with no staff and no real operations, whose sole function is to sit between two other things so that the line connecting them becomes difficult to follow. Money enters on one side, leaves on the other, and the paperwork in the middle obscures the journey. This particular shell existed to receive funds from various sources and push them onward to accounts held in Camilla's name in several countries. The shell itself was owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands. One paper company owned by a second paper company in another jurisdiction does not arise by accident. No one wakes up one morning holding a layered offshore structure. Someone constructs it. Someone pays professionals to construct it. Any auditor recognizes the arrangement on site as a mechanism designed for one purpose: making financial activity hard to trace. Mitchell escalated the matter to her senior partners. They informed the palace. Forensic accountants were brought in, and the picture ceased to be a small, uncategorized payment. 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich had been opened between 2003 and 2005. Together, they held roughly £3.2 million. The dates matter more than the sums. Charles and Camilla were married in April 2005 at Windsor Guildhall. Those Swiss accounts were opened in the months leading up to that wedding and in the period immediately around it. The transaction histories showed regular deposits from a range of sources, some British, some routed through jurisdictions that made tracing difficult. Withdrawals were almost non-existent. Money entered and remained. These were accounts built to accumulate, not to spend. Cayman Islands accounts opened in 2007 held more than £4 million. The funds arrived mostly from British sources through intermediate accounts that blurred their origin. The detail that transformed the matter from awkward to fatal is that deposits continued through 2024. This was not forgotten money from an earlier life. This was not a dormant account with a lost password. Funds moved into these accounts throughout Camilla's years as Duchess of Cornwall, throughout the year of the coronation, and throughout her time as Queen Consort. She was crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 2023, and the deposits continued after that date. The pattern was ongoing concealment, not an older omission that had simply never been corrected. A further cluster in Luxembourg, approximately £1.3 million, appears to have functioned as a collecting point, gathering smaller payments before directing them toward Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The shape of the arrangement is more revealing than the individual totals. Money arrives at a collection point in one country, moves outward to accounts in 2 others, and 2 paper companies sit in the middle of the route. Someone designed that structure. Someone sat down with people who specialize in such work and calculated how to move money without making the movement obvious. No one constructs such architecture by accident. Investigators then asked the only question that ultimately matters in cases of this kind: who had placed the money there? The file did not name the sources with clarity. Some deposits appeared to originate with wealthy individuals connected to Prince Andrew's social circle, including several associated with controversial figures or with businesses themselves under scrutiny for financial irregularities. Other sums traced to companies operating in sectors where a royal connection would carry considerable value. No direct arrangement has been proved, and care is required on that point. Yet the timing of certain deposits, sitting close to events Camilla hosted or to causes she publicly supported, produced a pattern the investigators could not dismiss. Money arrived in Camilla's accounts during the precise periods when Andrew was known to be seeking funds to cover legal costs and settlement obligations. No direct transfer between the two could be identified. No single payment carried both names. But the coincidences of timing repeated across years until coincidence itself became an insufficient explanation. Andrew's public history is already on record. After the Newsnight interview of November 2019, he stepped back from duties, and the family has managed the consequences ever since. Investigators now face the possibility that while the institution institution publicly distanced itself from Andrew, money connected to his world had been moving quietly through the accounts of the woman standing beside the king. Intent has not been confirmed, and I will not invent it. The family's subsequent actions, however, speak more clearly than any formal statement. Palace officials brought Princess Anne into the matter in mid-November for a single reason. The scope had moved beyond undisclosed assets and into territory that appeared criminal. Once that threshold is crossed inside the family, someone must be informed who will not flinch. Anne has always been that person. She arrives without drama, without favored journalists, without concern for public presentation. She reads the file and says what no one else in the room wishes to voice. Those briefed on the investigation describe her reaction as horror. What she said after examining the documents became the sentence on which the entire case would rest. This was not merely hidden money. This was a structure designed to conceal ongoing financial activity from the family, from palace officials, and from the authorities. That degree of planning, she said, pointed to someone who knew the wrongness of what was being done, not to someone who had simply overlooked paperwork. The distinction is decisive. Auditors had found balances, money sitting undeclared, badly categorized, serious, embarrassing, yet potentially survivable. Had that been the whole of it, the matter might have ended in a quiet settlement, a revised disclosure, and a paragraph in an appendix no one outside the building would ever read. Anne looked at the same documents and named what auditors are not paid to name. She named intent. Undeclared accounts do not cost titles. Deliberate concealment does. Everything that followed in the next fortnight flowed from that reframing in that single room. Camilla had spent 30 years as the most disliked woman in Britain, not in the ordinary social sense, but in a way that produced boos in supermarket car parks and waves of hostile correspondence whenever her name appeared on an official document. All of it traced back to one earlier tragedy. Diana's death in 1997 produced a national verdict, and that verdict followed Camilla into every room for the next 2 decades. She climbed out of it by steady, uncomplaining work. Hundreds of engagements each year, no self-justifying interviews, no public argument, simply showing up in provincial towns in the rain until the country's appetite for hatred gradually exhausted itself. On the 6th of May 2023, she stood in Westminster Abbey with a crown on her head while the world watched. That position had been earned inch by inch. In the autumn of 2025, watching an auditor begin to ask questions about Luxembourg, she would not have been thinking primarily about money. She would have been thinking about those 30 years and about how quickly everything built over them could be removed if the wrong pages reached the wrong hands. That fear, held alone at 3 in the morning because the one person who might have been told could never be told, explains the recklessness that followed. William received the briefing on the 25th of November, 3 days before his father. Palace legal counsel took him through the structures, the timeline, the sources, and the consequences if the material reached the public in the wrong sequence. His first question was not about Camilla. He asked whether his father might be implicated, whether Charles could have known and failed to declare. The investigation had found nothing to suggest Charles knew. William understood at once, however, that the question would be asked publicly, regardless of the findings, and that managing that suspicion would prove almost as difficult as managing the scandal itself. His instinct in such matters was formed early. On the 6th of September 1997, he was 15 years old, walking behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the world watched. Everything private about Diana became public property within a week. He has spent nearly 30 years observing what happens when a private matter escapes the family's control, and his response never varies: get ahead of it, or it will get ahead of you. Charles was told on the 28th of November. Those present describe it as the worst briefing of his reign. Advisors laid out the accounts, the amounts, the opening dates, and the sources so far as they could be traced. He refused at first to accept it. He searched for administrative explanations for some innocent reading the papers would not supply. He went back through the documents looking for the version in which his wife had not lied to him, and the documents would not yield it. She had been concealing millions throughout their entire marriage. While he defended her in public, while he pressed for her acceptance, while he asked a skeptical country to trust her, she had been hiding wealth of which he knew nothing. His voice, according to one person in the room, had gone hollow. The cost to a man of his history is particular. In the 1990s, he had stood between 2 women while the country watched him choose, and that choice had ended in a funeral and 3 decades of slow repair. Every careful step of Camilla's rehabilitation had been an attempt to prove the choice had been justified. On the 28th of November, a folder showed him that the woman he had spent a lifetime defending had been conducting something behind his back the entire entire time. He was losing not only a wife that afternoon, he was losing the argument he had spent 30 years making about his own life. The confrontation took place the same evening. Charles cleared the room. Only 2 protection officers remained within calling distance, as security protocol required. Those officers are the reason anything is known of the next 3 hours. Camilla entered the study at 7:15. She knew something was wrong. She did not yet know its scale. Charles was seated behind his desk rather than in the informal chairs by the window where they usually spoke. After 20 years of marriage, the arrangement itself conveyed the message. Documents lay in front of him in date order: bank statements, account records, transaction histories, corporate structures. He said nothing. He simply gestured for her to look. He later told William the silence had not been tactical. He had remained quiet because, even at that moment, he still wanted an explanation he had been unable to invent for himself. She did not provide one. Her first response was denial, not of the account's existence, but of any wrongness in them. They were old accounts from before the marriage. Family money kept separate, nothing that required declaration. Charles pointed to the transaction dates that ran through the marriage and continued through her time as Queen Consort. The denials weakened. The defensiveness grew louder. He then turned to the pages concerning Andrew, the people in Andrew's orbit, the deposits that arrived during Andrew's most difficult financial periods, the repeated coincidences of timing. He asked directly what she had been involved in, because the pattern no longer looked like ordinary savings. That is when she broke. She said she had been protecting the family. Andrew had come to her years earlier in desperation, and she had tried to help without forcing Charles to choose between his brother and proper conduct. The accounts, she claimed, had been Andrew's idea, a means of holding funds without a direct line back to him, sitting in her name until the money could move onward to cover his obligations. The answer damaged her either way. If true, she had participated in an arrangement designed to help Andrew evade accountability. If false, she had attempted to place the entire burden on the one member of the family no one would defend. In either case, it confirmed what Charles had entered the room hoping was not true. His wife had been involved in financial arrangements she deliberately hid from him, and those arrangements were tied to the family member whose difficulties had already inflicted the greatest recent damage on the monarchy. He asked the question that mattered most to him. Had she married him with those accounts already open? Had she stood beside him at Windsor while concealing them? Her answer was hedged, but it amounted to yes. Some accounts predated the wedding. Others were opened afterwards. She had never told him because she knew he would insist they be declared or closed. That justification finished the matter. Not the sums, but the justification. Charles told her she had made him an unwitting participant in her deception. Every public defense he had offered, every time he had asked a skeptical country to trust his wife, he had been vouching for someone who was lying to him about the basic facts of her own life. He asked whether she understood what she had done to his credibility and to the institution he had waited 70 years to lead. She attempted to minimize the scale. The amounts were not large by royal standards. No public money was involved. She had never used her position for personal enrichment, only to assist family. He cut through all 3 claims in a single answer later described as devastating. The amount did not matter. Whether public funds were involved did not matter. What mattered was the concealment of millions, the possibility of money from unaccountable sources, and the years of lying. That was not a private family difficulty. It was institutional liability. Raised voices continued for a long time. When Camilla left the study 3 hours later, staff saw her cross the landing alone, mascara streaked, moving unsteadily, one hand against the wall. 78 years old, queen that morning, she passed her own staff at 10 o'clock at night with her face ruined, and no one stepped forward because no one yet knew whether they were still permitted to. She went directly to her private apartments and spoke to no one. Charles summoned his private secretary and legal counsel the same night. His instructions were not open to discussion. He required a full legal analysis of what removing her titles would entail. He required her departure from Clarence House within 48 hours. He required a statement explaining the reasons. Advisors suggested caution and further investigation. He would not shift. She had admitted concealing accounts connected to Andrew's difficulties. That was sufficient. He would not allow the Crown to be implicated in whatever those arrangements had been. William was called to Clarence House at midnight and found his father exhausted but immovable. Charles insisted the decision was not emotional. Institutional liability had been created through deception, and as king he could not overlook it, whatever his private feelings. William accepted that action was required but argued for more time and ordinary process. Charles refused. Every day she remained Queen Consort, while the facts were known, was another day the institution was lying. It would end at once. The decisive element, held back until now, lies in the middle of November and in Anne's reading of the file. While others examined the accounts and the impressive sums, Anne examined the calendar. Sarah Mitchell's first written query about the Luxembourg payments had been sent in October. 11 days later, instructions had gone out from Camilla's side to wind up the Luxembourg entity, to close the Geneva and Zurich accounts and move the balances, and to clear the associated records as routine housekeeping. No one else had placed those two dates side by side. Forensic accountants were still mapping origins. Lawyers were still debating disclosure obligations. The room was looking at structure rather than at time. Anne looked at the clock and understood within a minute what she held. Camilla was not tidying. She was closing the arrangement down while the audit was still in progress, and moving to dispose of the paperwork while a firm appointed by Parliament remained mid-review. Had those instructions been allowed to complete, the Luxembourg entity would have dissolved, the Swiss balances would have moved to jurisdictions without reporting agreements, and the records would have disappeared. Reynolds Partners would have been left with a £5,000 monthly payment to a company that no longer existed, and Sarah Mitchell would have written an inconclusive note about an arrangement that could not be verified. Camilla would have made a modest disclosure, apologized for imperfect record-keeping, and remained Queen Consort for the rest of her life. None of this would ever have been known. Anne stopped it. She placed one call that afternoon and had the dissolution and the account closures frozen before they could finish. She acted before informing Charles, before legal advice was complete, before any family position had been decided. She acted first and explained afterwards. That is the most characteristic action in the entire sequence. She had entered the room prepared to keep the matter inside the family. She found evidence that the woman at the center was already burying it herself. Anne is constitutionally incapable of covering for someone who is actively covering for themselves. The moment she saw those 11 days, discretion ceased to be available, because discretion would have made her complicit in the covering up. Anne did not expose the accounts. The auditors had already found them. She exposed the attempt to make them disappear. That distinction is what removed the titles. Undeclared accounts can still be argued as unclear rules or premarital arrangements. Moving to destroy records 11 days after an auditor's question removes every innocent explanation at a stroke. It is the single document in the file that proves knowledge. That is why the Privy Council did not hesitate, why Parliament moved in 2 days, and why 5 days proved possible. Removing royal titles is not the same as ordinary divorce. It requires parliamentary action, the advice of the Privy Council, and a search for precedent where almost none exists. The nearest historical comparisons, the stripping of titles from German relatives during the First World War and the abdication of 1936, did not fit. Charles was seeking to remove titles from a sitting Queen Consort for financial misconduct, and no modern precedent existed. Advice returned in stages. A formal request would have to go to Parliament through the Home Secretary. The Privy Council would have to advise on constitutional propriety. Legislation would then be required to revoke the titles granted by letters patent at the time of the marriage. Letters patent are the legal instrument by which a monarch grants a title. What arrives on a sealed document can be removed by another. Charles instructed that emergency procedures be used. The Privy Council met on the 30th of November. Evidence was presented, including Camilla's admission and the 11 days. After hours of deliberation, the Council advised that parliamentary action would be proper. Emergency legislation was introduced on the 1st of December, brief and specific. The vote passed late on the 2nd. Royal assent followed at once. Charles signed away his own wife's titles. Those who observed him described it as the most painful constitutional duty of his reign. His accompanying statement was short. He spoke of profound sadness, of serious financial irregularities that made the title of Queen Consort untenable, and of the need to protect the integrity of the crown. He asked for privacy. Camilla responded through lawyers, disputing misconduct and reserving her rights. Legally, the matter was finished. She was no longer Queen Consort, no longer a duchess, only a private citizen still married in name to a king. The country divided along familiar lines. Older observers who remembered the long climb back from the 1990s often felt the penalty exceeded the offense. Younger observers saw hidden millions offshore while the country struggled and the monarchy received public funds under promises of transparency and found little room for sympathy. The investigation continued. Further payments from British businessmen emerged, timed near events Camilla had hosted or causes she had supported. Her children issued issued a statement defending her motives. For Charles, the personal cost was deeper than the scandal itself. Nearly 50 years of attachment, and the question whether he had ever truly known the woman he had defended. He aged visibly within a fortnight. He left Clarence House for colder apartments in Buckingham Palace. William supported his father publicly while privately noting the new precedent. No position inside the family was any longer permanent. Catherine assumed additional responsibilities earlier than expected. Constitutional scholars continue to argue whether the use of Parliament to remove titles at a husband's request was legitimate cooperation or a dangerous precedent. One question persists. Investigators found no evidence that Charles knew before the 28th of November. Many still find it difficult to accept that concealment on that scale could continue for 2 decades without a single visible signal. The suggestion that he may simply have chosen not to look has not disappeared. Charles chose the institution over the woman, the crown over 50 years of his own life. History will judge the choice as strength or as severity according to the writer. Anne, alone with a folder and no one watching, could have closed the file. She had spent a lifetime protecting the institution by quiet means. She picked up the telephone instead. Everything that followed came from that single call. Camilla lost 30 years of patient work, the crown she had earned inch by inch, and the acceptance she had finally achieved. The hidden accounts alone might have been survived. Britain can be surprisingly forgiving of money when confession comes early and is accompanied by evident embarrassment. The 11 days destroyed her. Between an auditor's polite written question and the instructions to dissolve companies and clear records, she had one opportunity to walk into the study and tell her husband what he was about to learn from others. She used that opportunity to try to make the evidence disappear. When the light finally came on, her first instinct was to reach for the switch. That is what took everything she had spent 3 decades building.